B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. I'm not taking a break because of the pandemic. I plan to be here unless they tell me I've got to lock the doors of the secret studio and hunker down only at home. It's Monday, March 16th, 2020. And as Americans are captured, paralyzed by fear, we've seen the panic buying of all kinds of food and toilet paper. Many Americans realize, because of the lack of leadership from the federal government, that we're pretty much on our own. We've seen a spike in gun and ammunition sales. People who have deep-seated fears and Second Amendment reactions. And against the backdrop of the fear, the selfishness, the me-first approach, it is really heartwarming to me that after a friend of Chelsea Manning, a person named Kelly Wright, opened up a GoFundMe account just after Chelsea was finally released from a year's confinement over the contemptible contempt charges, 7,000 Americans contributing between $5 and $10,000 raised all of the money needed to erase the $267,000 that the cruel judge, whose name is Trenga, that would be Anthony J. Trenga of the U.S. Eastern District of Virginia. And so, despite his efforts to impose these onerous fines on a woman who clearly is broke and who stood on principle despite facing bankruptcy because of the cruel tactics of Judge Trenga, well, 7,000 Americans recognized the outrage and came together to raise that money. And then there was a second crowdfunding campaign at GoFundMe that was launched to raise about $30,000 to help with Chelsea Manning's living expenses. As far as I know, she put all her stuff in storage, she lost her apartment, and she has no obvious source of income. Well, within 24 hours, about 1,000 contributors had already donated an additional $39,000, blowing past the target. So that's what I look for at this moment of national crisis. And I appreciate all the people who've reached out to check on me and say, hey, are you okay? I talked to all of my brothers here in the United States. I have one brother in England. And the bros are all okay and their families. And I wish the same to you at this difficult time. We've all been forced into an unexpected and, for many people, unpaid vacation of an indefinite length. And despite the mania, the hysteria at Costco's and other outlets across the country, most people I know are managing pretty well. And while the changes in our lifestyles imposed by different governments at the state or local level are certainly a burden, I think we're rediscovering all the stuff in our houses. We've been working on different projects and enjoying the leisure of reading books, watching videos and movies that have been stacking up. And this may continue for a while. Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the communicable diseases expert over there at the CDC, and I'm going to lay off criticizing him for his past. The guy is 79 years old, and he has delicately and sometimes indelicately stood up to the madness of Donald Trump. And Fauci is strongly suggesting that we should declare a 14-day national shutdown, require every American to hunker down. And I have I find this credible. I know there are skeptics out there, people who want to go to a bar. I'm not much of a bar guy. And people don't like their behaviors restricted. And if you don't believe this is a real threat, then you want to go about your daily life, and you see, those people, I believe, are oblivious to what we've seen in Iran, in Italy, and originally in China. So I think it's likely that this is going to happen. We've seen governors ask for people not to gather in crowds. First it was more than 500, then it was 250, then it was 100. And Trump, who apparently has gotten some religion on this, today recommended no gatherings of more than 10 people for the duration. Now, Trump himself has reported that he failed a test. Well, he got a negative result from a test for the coronavirus. And I don't wish this virus on anyone, even a creepy guy like Trump. But we can't even believe the White House report that he tested negative because this guy is such a compulsive and consistent liar. So once again, our listener and whistleblower, Linda Lewis, has put together a great summary for me of the news you need to know about the coronavirus. The latest numbers are 3,487 cases across the United States. The death toll earlier today was at 68. The worldwide death toll is above 6,500. And we haven't reached peak infection, particularly in Italy, where the percentage of cases leading to fatalities are alarmingly high at this point. The hardest hit states, Washington, with 42 cases. California has far more than the reported cases, and I believe is kind of in second place right now. New York State has a rash of cases. And from everything we know, it is still in the incubation period. There are people carrying the virus who don't know it, who can infect other people. And even if they are ridiculously healthy and come through it themselves, the risk of spreading it to vulnerable people is perhaps at a very high point. I wanted to call it a peak, but I don't know that. But let's say it is it's a high number, and it continues to rise. Alex Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, he's the guy who used to work for Eli Lilly, right there in the pharma industry. And he has named a point person, Admiral Brett Giroir, Assistant Secretary for Health and head of the Public Health Service, to coordinate the diagnostic testing efforts among public health agencies. We're also told by many reports that the Crown Prince of the Trump administration, Jared Kushner, appears to be central to the administration's bungled response. We're told that he was a major writer of the presidential Oval Office speech last Wednesday that didn't comfort or reassure anyone and led to another huge drop in the markets. So according to the German newspaper Die Welt, which first reported this on Sunday, Trump has offered a German company that is said to be developing a vaccine, they're called CureVac, about $1 billion in exchange for exclusive access to the vaccine. The newspaper quoted an unnamed German government source who said Trump wanted the resulting vaccine only for the United States. But another German official quoted in the New York Times said it was unclear whether the administration simply wanted the research work and for any resulting production to be on American soil. But these are the kinds of things that alienate the international community, make the United States suspect, untrustworthy. And we appear to believe that we've got this American exceptionalism and a whole lot of cash, and so we can buy our way out of this crisis, and who cares about the rest of the world? And instead of offering to, invest $1 billion and share the results with all nations that are afflicted by the pandemic, Trump is once going, into an America First zone. And as I mentioned last week, raising the drawbridges here at Fortress America. Trump has also directed Steve Mnuchin, the foreclosure king, Secretary of Treasury, to provide relief from tax deadlines to Americans who've been adversely affected. I'm working on my taxes right now, and if I don't have an April 15 deadline, I'd really like to know that. We'll see when we get some clarity on that. Late on Friday, the House remained in session, and by a vote of 363 to 40, they passed the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And there's some good things in it. But because of all of the negotiations that were required to get it through, and Mnuchin was the White House point person on that, well, there are a lot of exemptions. So, for example, the measure gives some workers 2 weeks of paid sick leave and up to 3 months of paid family and medical leave at a rate of 2/3 of their pay, no less than 2/3 of your pay. Now, the benefits only apply to employees of businesses with fewer than 500 workers or the government, people who are infected by the virus, quarantined, have a sick family member, or are impacted by school closures. Large employers are excluded. The Labor Department will have the option of exempting workers at any company with less than 50 employees. The exemptions could potentially exclude nearly 20 million workers. About 59 million Americans work for companies with less than 500 employees. And inexplicably, there's also an exclusion for certain healthcare providers and emergency responders. I can't imagine why that was the result of the negotiation. Now, at this hour, I haven't heard about Senate action. The Senate had planned to be on recess this week, but McConnell brought them back into session. Trump has said he would sign the negotiated bill. Also, it includes about $1 billion for expansion of food security programs, including SNAP, or what we used to call food stamps. And it pumps $1 billion into state unemployment insurance funds. So it's well-intentioned. I think it's only a part of the picture. I believe that if our concerns are borne out and we see a massive number of cases and the need for Americans to be quarantined or hunker down for longer periods of time, that these benefits will be expanded. Now, Trump also, in declaring finally a national state of emergency on Friday, it triggers the Stafford Act. And in the accounts controlled under the Stafford Act, there's already about $40 billion, which will be released, we believe, almost immediately, to buy medical supplies, equipment. And it also activates the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to coordinate a response. We'll see if that coordination gets overtaken by the control freaks at the White House. So in California, in New York State, in Washington State, the governors have announced variations on this theme. Temporarily shutting down restaurants. In California, Governor Newsom has suggested that restaurants can stay open, but that he only wants about half of the usual occupancy. and he recommends that people use takeout or delivery only. In, I believe, all three of the states, bars and tasting rooms for wineries have been ordered shut down. And, I'm not complaining here. I just want to tell you that I thought I might get an opportunity to go skiing during this forced vacation because we finally got some rain here in California, producing snow in the Sierra Nevada, like 5 feet of fresh snow since Thursday. But on Saturday, the ski resorts virtually all announced that they are shutting down immediately. So the school closures are uneven. And there are various rationales that, this puts a burden on parents, many of whom need to work, parents who aren't able to work from home, and that's many, many parents. And also the issues of whether students who qualify for free meals would miss those meals if they're not going to school. Now, the biggest and most obvious blunder that was visible over the weekend was these long lines, particularly at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, as people who were forced by Trump's travel ban to return to the United States en masse were lined up for as long as 7 hours in very close proximity to other travelers. And this turned the airports and the international arrivals and the baggage halls and the customs zones into virus transmission zones. And from everything we know, these people at most got their temperature scanned. Arrivals in San Francisco were not backed up, but there was not even somebody with one of those ray guns to check the temperature of people getting off the planes. So the inconsistencies of this federal response, the lack of planning, Trump's internal need to seem decisive and to make moves that are impractical like this, well, a lot of people paid the price, and I'll bet they are just fuming because they can't get a coronavirus test at this point, and they will be living with the fear that they've contracted the virus for some length of time. This is sheer incompetence. This is willful negligence. And it's just a sorry state of affairs here in the United States. And that's why the headline for this podcast is a quote from an old Jim Morrison song by The Doors, "Strange Days Have Found Us." Again, I want to thank Linda Lewis, who is on a daily basis compiling a summary for me to give you the baseline information about the development of the pandemic and the response, such as it is. And I want to read to you a post that she put up on Facebook a couple of days ago. Now, as you know, or maybe you don't, Linda is a retired federal government employee. She was a whistleblower, and she was a disaster preparedness official. Quoting from Linda Lewis, "Preparing for unthinkable disasters was my job as a weapons of mass destruction preparedness specialist for the federal government. The coronavirus circulating in the world now has been the subject of experimentation in bioweapons labs around the world. While this particular virus may be a natural mutation, it is nevertheless functioning like a bioweapon, one that targets vulnerable and elderly people, that is, citizens who have little value to the multinational corporations that routinely bribe government officials." Now, let me pause in quoting her to note that there was a reported breach of the federal bioweapons labs at Fort Detrick last year. I will also note, just as a matter of fact, that Wuhan, China, is the site of a Chinese government bioweapons, or at least biological agent, research facility. At this point, I can't go any further to make any claims about the origins of the coronavirus. But I will continue to pursue that, and if we get any useful information, I'll be happy to share it with you. Returning now to Linda Lewis's post. The way government officials have handled this looming disaster has been criminally inadequate, in large part because Trump and his political appointees prioritize protecting wealthy corporate interests and power. Those mistakes will be magnified by the inadequacy of America, medical and social welfare systems for years, undermined by corporate interests who bribe Congress to chisel away at public funding and regulatory controls, leaving this the only major nation without universal health care. Those who for years insisted that America is the greatest nation are about to see it turn seemingly overnight into a third world country. In fact, that process has been ongoing for some time. Republicans and moderate Democrats auctioned off public assets, allowed their biggest backers to pocket the wealth, and hid it all behind propaganda manufactured by corporatized media. All of them had a hand in creating the coming disaster, but none will ever accept responsibility. For the sake of your children, who will be spared the virus worst but remain vulnerable to other disasters, it is vital that we learn this lesson. Biden will not save America. Biden helped create this disaster. Biden kept the citizens of Delaware in the dark about another looming disaster, inadequacies in state preparedness to respond to a nuclear emergency and a nuclear power plant with a history of technical problems. Biden sat on my whistleblower disclosure, undoubtedly to protect political and corporate fortunes, just as Trump has done with coronavirus. That time the public got lucky. The nuclear plant did not melt down. And she adds, when you vote, if you get to vote, remember all this. And one of the issues that is still up in the air, tomorrow is primary election day. Louisiana has delayed its elections, but Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio are still planning to conduct the voting. And at this point, it's a tough call. But if the elections are held, it's pretty clear to me that there will be extremely low turnout, and democracy will suffer as a result. The other thing that is a huge loss, at least to me, is, I'm so obsessive in my coverage of the news and the amount of time I spend on it every day that I look for comic relief. I watch The Daily Show, I watch Stephen Colbert, I watch Bill Maher, and Sunday nights I watch John Oliver. Well, they have all eliminated studio audiences. And most of these shows are going on an indefinite hiatus. And it was weird. I watched Colbert's Thursday night show where he had about 15 of his staff members in the audience. Bill Maher on Friday did the same thing. And these shows do suffer without an audience to laugh at the comics' jokes. And poor John Oliver, his studio was quarantined because somebody, who's possibly coronavirus positive was in it, and also the offices where he and his crew write those jokes were off limits because of a purported threat. So John Oliver was in some tiny studio with a white wall, and all they could do was post some graphics on the screen next to him. But he did make the show go on, and I respect that. And it's going to be hard to get by without timely comic relief. So I have really mixed feelings about the Fox News anchor Tucker Carlson. When he used to wear a bow tie and work at MSNBC, I frequently referred to him, and I never screwed up, as that little mother Tucker Carlson. But it turns out that he may have been pivotal in convincing Trump to abandon his denial and his efforts to con the virus into submission. Apparently, last week he called Trump, and Trump takes his calls, along with Sean Hannity, and said, "Hey, Don, this is bad for your career." And Peter Weiner, who is a writer at The Atlantic, he's a Republican never-Trumper, He published a lengthy piece on Friday entitled "The Trump Presidency is Over." And he basically says that Trump's bad response to coronavirus is going to take down his administration. Now, I think that there's a part of wishful thinking, and a part of this is premature, because the Trump cult will all have to get the coronavirus, I guess, in order to shake them of their loyalty to their president. But Weiner notes, I'm joining this in progress here in the wind-up phase of his column. The president claimed the number of cases in Italy was getting much better when it was getting much worse. In one of the more stunning statements an American president has ever made, Trump admitted his preference was to keep a cruise ship off the California coast rather than allowing it to dock because he wanted to keep the numbers low. To make matters worse, the president delivered an Oval Office address that was meant to reassure the nation and the markets, but instead shook both. His delivery was awkward and stilted, and at several points he decided to ad-lib instead of reading the teleprompter, misstated his administration's own policies, which had to be corrected. Stock futures plunged, even as the president was still delivering his speech. He called for Americans to unify together as one nation and one family, despite having referred to Washington Governor Jay Inslee as a snake just days before and attacking Democrats the morning after it. He quotes Dan Baltz of the Washington Post, "Almost everything that could have gone wrong with the speech did go wrong. Taken together, this is a massive failure in leadership that stems from a massive defect in character. Trump is such an habitual liar that he's incapable of being honest, even when being honest would serve his interests. He is so impulsive, short-sighted, and undisciplined that he is unable to plan or even think beyond the moment. He is such a divisive and polarizing figure that he long ago lost the ability to unite the nation under any circumstances and for any cause. And he is so narcissistic and unreflective that he is completely incapable of learning from his mistakes. The president's disordered personality makes him as ill-equipped to deal with a crisis as any president has ever been. With few exceptions, what Trump has said is not just useless, it is downright injurious." And his closer, "Trump is shrinking before our eyes. The coronavirus is quite likely to be the Trump presidency's inflection point. When everything changed, when the bluster and ignorance and shallowness of America's 45th president became undeniable, an empirical reality, as indisputable as the laws of science or a mathematical equation. It has taken a good deal longer than it should have, but Americans have now seen the con man behind the curtain. The president, enraged for having been unmasked, will become more desperate, more embittered, more unhinged. He knows nothing will be the same. His administration may stagger on, but it will only be a hollow shell. The Trump presidency is over." And similarly, in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu is desperately trying to use the coronavirus to remain in office. Over the weekend, he made a proposal to Benny Gantz, the rival Blue and White Party leader, saying, "Hey, why don't we have a joint crisis government? I'll run it." Because of the coronavirus. And get this, Bibi even used this moment to reveal to the people of Israel that the state has been spying on them, has collected metadata and cell phone data, just like the good old NSA has here. But Netanyahu revealed this in service of his crisis government, saying he has authorized the Shin Bet to tap into this vast and previously undisclosed trove of cell phone data to retrace the movements of people who have contracted the coronavirus and identify others who should be quarantined because their paths crossed. Now, this is Big Brother on a major scale. But in a move that enraged his opponents, Bibi's justice minister on Sunday severely curtailed the courts, a move that was followed hours later by the postponement of Netanyahu's criminal trial on bribery, which is scheduled to begin tomorrow. And to add a little injury to these insults, the ceremonial president of Israel, Reuben Rivlin, he is giving first opportunity to the Blue and White Party to form a government because they got 61 seats in the Knesset, and Netanyahu only got 59. However, the advantage of the Blue and White Party is based on the support of the Arab Joint List and the racism, the apartheid mentality that infects too much of Israel, including Benny Gantz, who is, just a slight improvement over Netanyahu. He's just not accused of corruption. This is a real threat to the formation of a government after 3 attempts at an election because of the inherent distrust of the Arab citizens of the State of Israel and their representatives in the Knesset. Oh, there will be more. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins podcast with your subscriptions. And if the stock market keeps tanking, your humble host may have to go get a job. I think many people are confronted by this as our stock market holdings are dropping daily. Anyway, don't feel sorry for me. I'm going to be okay. But I do want to thank the people who support me with their subscriptions to this podcast, like Brian Mazzy, Terry Paris, Theodore Kelly, and Cheryl Fleming. They each chip in $5 or $10 a month. Could you do that? I'd love it if you can. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can take it from there. So today, the Dow dropped another 13%. And this is after how on Sunday, while the markets were closed, the Federal Reserve announced that it was lowering interest rates to just about zero. It is putting more money into the banking system. It's using almost all of the tricks that were used after the 2008 financial meltdown. They have reopened the discount window number 2 at the Fed. And that's where banks can borrow money at now almost zero interest. So we won't know for some time how many trillions of dollars the Fed is inserting into the economy. But it hasn't done any good so far. The money just burns up as soon as the markets open. Interesting commentary from a Wall Street veteran in the New York Times today. His name is Ruchir Sharma. He says, though the Fed moved over the weekend to slash rates and buy treasuries, markets around the world fell on Monday anyway. The coronavirus threatens to set off financial contagion in a world economy with very different vulnerabilities than on the eve of the crisis at the end of the Bush administration 12 years ago. In key ways, the world is now or more deeply in debt as it was when the last big crisis hit. But the largest and most risky pools of debt have shifted from households and banks, which were restrained by regulators, to corporations all over the world. As businesses deal with the prospect of a sudden stop in their cash flows, the most exposed are a relatively new generation of companies that already struggle to pay their loans. Some are called zombies, companies that earn too little to even make interest payments on their debt and survive only by issuing new debt. And he says that the impact of a once-in-a-century pandemic on a world economy saddled with record levels of debt, well, I'll just say that it appears to frighten him quite a bit. And even before the dimensions of their losses are known, the airlines are asking for $50 billion in a federal handout. $30 billion in grants for passenger airlines and cargo carriers, and another $25 billion in loans and temporary tax relief that they want to last all the way through the end of next year. Now, this is predictable, because after 9/11, we bailed out the airlines. We took over the costs of airport security at the federal, taxpayer level. And so they're just used to it. And if you only read one thing today linked in my show file, read this commentary from Columbia professor Tim Yu, published in the New York Times, headlined, "Don't Feel Sorry for the Airlines." Before the 2008 meltdown, the industry profits were about $500 million a year. In 2015, the industry profits were $7.6 billion. A lot of that is from those really annoying baggage fees. But Tim Wu writes, in particular about American Airlines, it blew most of its cash on a stock buyback spree from 2014 to 2020. It spent more than $15 billion buying back its own stock. It managed this despite the risk of a rainy day, and it shrank its cash reserves. It has now accumulated a debt of nearly $30 billion, 5 times the company's current market cap. In the wake of the outbreak, American Airlines has not yet asked for a bailout. Well, this was published before the demand letter that was issued by the airline industry lobbyists earlier today. And Wu writes, "We cannot permit American and other airlines to use federal assistance, whether it's a bailout or not, to weather the virus and return to business as usual. Before providing any loan relief, tax breaks, or cash transfers, we must demand that the airlines change how they treat their customers and employees and make basic changes in industry ownership structure." Well said. Also want to recommend a piece by our friend Scott Ritter, the former weapons inspector, publishing on a newsletter called World Energy Opinion. World Energy Opinion. I've linked to his commentary. And let me just read the summary for you here, and if you're intrigued, you can go deeper. Russia's decision not to go along with the OPEC Plus recommendations favored by Saudi Arabia for further cuts in oil production has triggered a price war that has sent the global oil market into a death spiral. While some analysts have singled out U.S. shale oil production as the ultimate target of Russian action, the reality is more complex. The breach with OPEC also reflects the failure of Russia's 4-year experiment to broaden relations with Saudi Arabia, as well as the once-in-a-century opportunity provided by the advent of the pandemic, which has put added downward pressure on global oil markets, thus maximizing Russia's ability to prevail in a long-term oil price war with either the U.S. or Saudi Arabia. In short, the confluence of Russian reaction to U.S. energy policy, souring Russian-Saudi relations, and the impact on global energy markets of the pandemic have created a perfect storm of geopolitical and energy security conditions conducive to Russia's bold intervention. And let me remind you that back in 2014, Saudi Arabia refused to cut production in an effort to challenge the growing output of U.S. shale oil production. And I believe that one of the rationales behind that whole scheme was to put economic pressure on Russia and Venezuela. And it certainly has hammered Venezuela. Last night was what will perhaps be the last debate in the Democratic presidential primary. I don't think the Democratic National Committee will schedule any more debates. They want to write Bernie Sanders out of this story as fast as possible. And let me begin by saying that Joe Biden performed quite well for himself last night. After the screwed-up town hall virtual meeting that he did the other day and more of his incoherent ramblings, he did not fuck up at all last night. In fact, it was Bernie who got into the gaffe zone because Biden kept talking about the Obama administration's response to Ebola as a model for the coronavirus, leading Sanders to reference Ebola when he meant coronavirus twice, and then on the third time he caught himself and said, "Joe, you got Ebola on my brain." Well, just got to be fair. The gaffe score was 1 for Bernie and 0 for Joe. But beyond that, Bernie did, in his own gentlemanly way, try to press Biden on their clear policy differences, try to show how Biden has lied about his repeated efforts over years to cut Social Security. And he jabbed Biden repeatedly on a whole range of issues. Biden squirmed a little bit. He lied a little bit. But he didn't crumble, and Bernie was not able to deliver a knockout blow. So ultimately, I don't think it changes the course of the primary, which is clearly trending against Bernie. And while it hasn't all been fair, we'll get at the end of the podcast here to the latest about the Michigan primary. It's clear that the momentum is behind Joe Biden, that people engage in self-inflicted amnesia to overlook all of his baggage. And new polls show that Biden is seen as the safe candidate to navigate through the uncertainty of the coronavirus pandemic and Trump's awful leadership. So I have to say that Bernie didn't yell as much. He does still wave his hands all over the place, and I know that annoys a lot of people. And he did make a very strong case for how different his view of America's problems are from Joe Biden's. Joe is a corporate incrementalist, and Bernie wants real, significant structural change in our system of governance, in the campaign structure, in health care delivery. So Biden is showing some interest in progressive voters. Before the debate, he announced a watered-down version of free college, as Bernie has advanced. He also, during the debate, acknowledged that he has changed his position on the bankruptcy rules and supports a rewrite that Elizabeth Warren has been advocating. But he lied about his role in the 2005 or so bankruptcy legislation, claimed that he didn't help write it and that he didn't like the bill. And these are provably false statements. But perhaps the most heated exchange was when Biden said that he had never expressed openness to cutting Social Security. And Bernie told everybody watching to go to the YouTube and look it up. And they got into the weeds of a Senate-style debate about who voted for what when, including the Simpson-Bowles deficit reduction scheme back in the 1990s. And Joe Biden supported that. Cuts to Social Security were very much a part of that package. And Biden said, "We did not cut it," referring to Social Security. I know, Sanders interjected, because people like me helped stop that. Perhaps the biggest takeaway was Joe Biden's promise to name a female as his vice presidential running mate and to name not only a female but a black woman to the United States Supreme Court. Now, I know that these appeal to certain people, but it is premature to start talking about your running mate when you don't have the nomination. And it's also risky to promise certain identity politics like a black woman on the Supreme Court. Because in each of these cases, it really depends on the person. And just checking a box that it's a woman or an African-American woman, that doesn't do much for me. So there's some interesting commentary on the debate last night. The New York Times gathers its pundits. Gail Collins giving Joe Biden a 9 out of 10. The huge question was whether Biden would stumble, fall into one of those oh, whoops, sorry moments, and he didn't. And that's about all that matters to her. Michelle Goldberg, Biden's insistence that he was never open to cutting Social Security was dishonest. His attack on Sanders for saying obviously true things about poverty reduction in China was smarmy. Well, I would call it demagoguery. And They used the Univision female anchor, Elia, I'm sorry, I don't know her last name, to surface the ambush question that Anderson Cooper launched on 60 Minutes 2 Sunday nights ago about Cuba. And Biden extended that because Bernie has said that poverty was reduced in China. And so Joe Biden is quite hypocritical and disingenuous because it was Obama who reopened Cuba with similar compliments about the successes of the Castro brothers regime. And Biden tries to have it both ways by saying that he denounces China as a totalitarian state, but that he is best suited because of his foreign policy experience to dealing with China. On to comments from Elizabeth Brunig, who gave Bernie Sanders an 8 out of 10. What's odd about Sanders is that he's simultaneously the ideas candidate. Unlike Biden, he has a philosophical brief against the excesses of American individualism, and the practical, materially focused candidate worrying over how low-wage workers will survive this crisis financially. That breadth of interest came through strongly in the debate, and the no-audience format suited him well. Gil Duran gives Sanders an 8. He was the most cogent candidate on the stage. In a subdued debate, he remained consistent. He's the only remaining Democrat for big structural change. He forced Biden in a more progressive direction. Shamel Bowie, 8 out of 10. If Biden tried at every turn to make the debate a question about what to do now, Sanders tried to turn the conversation to structural problems, to the larger dynamics that have produced the present crisis, whether it's the devastating effects of coronavirus or climate change. Nicole Hemmer, 8 out of 10. Sanders turned the volume down and dialed the compassion up. He made a strong case that the pandemic crisis is actually a structural one, and while he won't turn Biden into a Bernie bro, he and Warren have lured Biden left on everything from immigration to college debt, a surprising win for the revolution. Melanie Price, 8 out of 10. He was effective at challenging Biden on his support of legislation that progressives view as problematic. As Sanders' path to the White House disappears, he essentially vetted Biden for the progressive wing of the party, which will have to contend with Biden as the nominee. So, also want to recommend, this is worth quoting, Jessa Crispin. And who is Jessa? A host of the Public Intellectual podcast and a Guardian columnist. Sanders was too gentle on Biden. Throughout this primary, I've heard supporters of other candidates complain about Bernie, his tendency to raise his voice. Where the hell was that yelling Bernie on Sunday? His tendency to try to keep an undignified process dignified, and his discomfort with going for Joe Biden's throat were on clear display. That, I think, is accurate. And Nathan Robinson, also at The Guardian, I think he gets it right. You can read the entire piece. I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast. This quote, while correct on the issue, Sanders did not make a sufficiently cogent case linking the present crisis to broader systemic problems. That's a shame, because Sanders' policies are exactly what we need in an urgent moment. On the whole, Sanders delivered the kind of performance that he needed to at this stage, with Biden now the favorite. He had to deal Biden a knockout blow, to do unto Biden as Elizabeth Warren did unto Michael Bloomberg. He didn't. The exchanges between the two were often contentious, but while Sanders raised some concerns about whether Biden could inspire young voters and had harsh words about Biden's legislative record and climate change plans, there was no game-changing moment that exposed or humiliated Biden. And over at the Washington Post Never Bernie desk, Jennifer Rubin is citing a poll that is distressing. The latest NBC Wall Street Journal poll taken before last night's debate show the nationwide popularity of Joe Biden at 61 to 32%, with 52% definitely sold on Biden and 26% definitely with Sanders. So that is the disturbing trajectory of this year's primary election. And finally today, I note this podcast has gone on pretty long, but I hope people have more leisure time to listen to it. You decide how much you listen to. You've got the pause button, and you can always just turn it off. Anyway, more details from the discrepancy between the official tally and the exit polls in Michigan, where Joe Biden was projected to get 52% of the vote count, and he got 52.9%. And Bernie Sanders was projected to get 43% from the exit polls, and he got 36.4%, a loss of 15.4%. I can't explain it, but when you look at the pattern, South Carolina, Texas, Massachusetts, and I think there are at least 2 other states with serious discrepancies between exit polls and the official tally, I'd like an investigation. And regarding the screenshot that I talked about last week that showed 2 minutes apart Sanders losing 303,000 votes in the tally in Michigan on election night, I put the issue out to election integrity advocates. And I got this response from Richard Hayes Phillips, the man who proved that the 2004 election was stolen from John Kerry in Ohio. So he wrote, I analyzed this in numerous ways. But at 10:07, when Bernie was showing 303,000 votes that he allegedly lost, there were only a total of 1.377469 total votes. That's 1 million, under 400,000. This was with 60% of the precincts reporting. And I looked it up myself. There was only a total of 1.415 million votes cast in the Democratic primary in Michigan. So, based on those parameters, this is clearly an error. But it should be fully aired out. We should find out who authorized the shift in the vote tally and why. And fundamentally, we need dramatic reforms to our election system because it sucks. Thanks for listening to this lengthy daily news and comment podcast. You can share it everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.